I should have walked away the moment I saw him. But the rain wouldn't let me think, and neither did the way his chest barely moved under the dim streetlight, like the city itself was holding its breath. It was past midnight. My shift had run 12 hours too long, and all I wanted was my apartment, a hot shower, and silence. But instead I found him lying there between two parked cars, soaked, still, wrong, and something in me refused to leave, even when every instinct whispered that this wasn't just a man in trouble. This was something else, something dangerous. I could feel it in the way the air felt heavier around him, in the unnatural quiet of a block that was never this still, not in this part of town, not at this hour. I stepped closer anyway, my shoes splashing through shallow puddles, my breath catching as I knelt beside him, hands trembling but trained, always trained, checking for signs, for rhythm, for life. And then I felt it, faint but steady. He was alive, barely, but alive, and that should have been enough to call 911 and back away. Let professionals take over. Let this become someone else's story. But I didn't reach for my phone. I reached for him, pressing my palm gently against his side, trying to assess, to stabilize, to do something, anything, because leaving wasn't an option anymore, not when I had already crossed that invisible line between stranger and responsibility. And that's when his hand moved, fast, sudden, strong enough to stop my breath. Fingers wrapping around my wrist with a grip that didn't match the weakness of his body. His skin cold, but his hold unyielding, and his eyes opened, dark, focused, fully aware in a way that didn't make sense for someone in his condition. "Don't," he said, voice low, controlled, not pleading, not panicked, just a command, and I froze. Every nerve in my body lighting up with something I couldn't name. Fear maybe, or recognition. Like I had just stepped into something I didn't understand. "You need help?" I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to ignore the way his gaze locked onto mine like he was memorizing me, like I mattered in a way I definitely didn't. "I am help," he replied, and even through the weakness in his voice, there was something else there, something sharp, something that didn't belong in a man lying on cold concrete in the rain. I swallowed hard, my heart picking up speed, because people like him didn't just appear out of nowhere, and they definitely didn't end up like this by accident. But I couldn't stop now, not when I had already started, so I gently pulled my wrist free, slower this time, careful, like I was dealing with something unpredictable, and went back to work, using what I had, what I knew, what I could control, my hands steady even as my thoughts raced, the rain soaking through my clothes, through my hair, through everything. But I stayed, counting breaths, watching for changes, grounding myself in the only thing that made sense, keeping him here, keeping him breathing, because whatever he was, whatever world he came from, none of that mattered in this moment, not more than the simple fact that he was alive and slipping. And I wasn't going to let that happen, not on my watch, not tonight. Minutes stretched longer than they should have, time bending in that strange way it does when everything narrows down to one single point, one single purpose, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, his breathing steadied, his grip loosened, his eyes never leaving mine, not even once, like he was waiting for something, or deciding something. I couldn't tell, and honestly, I didn't want to know. I just wanted this to end, for him to be stable enough that I could finally step back, finally call for help, finally leave this behind like it never happened. But something told me it wouldn't be that simple. Nothing about this felt simple, not the silence, not the way the street stayed empty, not the way he looked at me like I had just changed something I didn't understand. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it shifted, headlights cut through the rain, black vehicles pulling up too smoothly, too quietly, doors opening in perfect sync, men stepping out dressed in dark suits that didn't belong in this part of the city, their presence immediate, controlled, unmistakable, and I felt it before anyone said a word. The atmosphere changed, the air tightened, like the world had just corrected itself around him, like this was where he belonged, not on the ground, not vulnerable, not human. One of them moved toward us, stopping just short, eyes scanning me, assessing, calculating, like I was a variable that hadn't been accounted for. And for the first time since I found him, I hesitated, not because I was afraid of what they might do, but because I realized something far worse. I had just stepped into a story that wasn't mine, a world I didn't understand, and there was no clear way out. I started to pull back, Instinct finally catching up, telling me to leave, to walk away while I still could, but his hand found mine again. Weaker now, but just as deliberate. And when I looked at him, really looked, I saw it. Not gratitude, not relief, but recognition, like I had crossed some invisible line the moment I touched him, like something had already been decided. You shouldn't have stopped, he said quietly, and the words didn't sound like a warning. They sounded like a truth I was only just beginning to understand. And in that moment, standing in the rain with strangers closing in and his eyes holding me in place, I realized something I wouldn't be able to forget. I didn't just save a man, I stepped into his world, and something told me it was already too late to walk away. His hand did not let go even when the men in dark suits closed in around us. And that was the moment I realized I was no longer the one in control of anything. The rain kept falling, steady, relentless, like the city was trying to wash this entire moment away, but nothing moved. Not the cars, not the air, not even me. I stayed there kneeling beside him, my pulse loud in my ears, as one of the men stepped closer, his shoes stopping just inches from where my knees pressed into the wet pavement. "Sir," he said, calm, respectful, like this was a routine interruption instead of something that felt like the center of a storm. And I felt the shift again, subtle but undeniable, the way everything seemed to orbit around the man I had just found lying on the ground, the way his presence pulled gravity toward him even now, even like this, and slowly, carefully, I pulled my hand back this time, expecting resistance, expecting that grip to tighten again, but it did not. His fingers loosened just enough to let me go, though his eyes never did. They stayed on me, steady, unblinking, like he was marking something down, something permanent, something I could not see. And I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady after being crouched for so long, my clothes heavy with rain, my mind racing ahead of me trying to catch up to what was happening. One of the men moved to support him, another opened an umbrella over him, shielding him from the rain that had soaked both of us through minutes ago, and the contrast hit me all at once. I looked down at myself, water dripping from my sleeves, my hair clinging to my face, my hands still stained with the evidence of what I had just done, and then I looked at them, clean, precise, controlled, like the rain did not dare touch them, like the world adjusted itself around their presence, and I understood something without anyone needing to say it. He did not belong to the street. He belonged to something far above it, something far more dangerous than anything I had ever encountered. "You should leave," one of them said to me, not harsh, not threatening, just final, like a door closing, and I nodded before I even realized I had decided to agree, because leaving suddenly felt like the only safe option left, the only way to pretend this had never happened, that I had not seen what I had seen, had not touched what I had touched, but my feet did not move right away. Something held me there. Maybe the way he was still watching me, maybe the way the moment refused to break cleanly, like it needed something else before it could end. And then he spoke again, quieter this time, but somehow clearer, cutting through the sound of the rain and the distant hum of the city. "Ava," he said, and my breath caught, sharp, immediate, because I had not told him my name. Not once, not at any point. I had barely said anything at all, and yet he said it like it belonged to him, like he had always known it, like it had been waiting there for him to use, and every instinct I had told me to ask how, to demand an explanation, to understand what I had just stepped into, but I did not, because something in his voice made questions feel irrelevant, like answers would not make this any safer. "Go home," he added, softer now, but no less certain, and this time I listened, this time I stepped back, then another, the distance between us growing inch by inch, step by step, until the space filled with men and motion, and something else I could not quite define, something that felt like finality, like a line had been drawn and I had just crossed it without realizing. I turned then, finally, forcing myself to walk away, not looking back even though I could feel it, that pull, that weight of his gaze still following me, still holding on to something I did not understand. I kept walking until the sound of the rain became louder than everything else, until the streetlights blurred together, until the world felt normal again. Or at least close enough to normal that I could pretend. But even then, even as I reached the corner and stepped under the weak glow of a flickering light, I knew something had changed. Something fundamental, something I could not undo. My hands still felt it, the warmth of his skin against mine, the pressure of his grip, the way his voice sounded when he said my name like it meant something, like I meant something, and that did not make sense. None of this made sense. I was just a nurse trying to get through another shift, another night, another long walk home. I was not supposed to be part of anything like this. Not supposed to be seen. Not like that. Not by someone like him. I reached my apartment building 10 minutes later, though it felt longer, like time had stretched in strange ways since I found him. The lobby lights buzzed softly overhead. Familiar. Grounding. I stepped inside, dripping water onto the tile floor, the warmth hitting my skin all at once, and for a second, just a second, I let myself breathe, let myself believe that maybe I had left it all outside, that maybe it would stay out there in the rain where it belonged. But when I pressed the elevator button and caught my reflection in the mirrored wall, I saw it immediately, something in my eyes that had not been there before, something sharper, more aware, like I had seen behind a curtain I was never meant to notice, and I realized then, standing there alone with the quiet hum of the building around me, that walking away did not mean escaping. Not really, because whatever that moment was, whatever he was, it had followed me, not in footsteps or shadows, but in something deeper, something that had already taken root. And as the elevator door slid open and I stepped inside, I heard his voice again in my head, low, steady, certain, saying my name like it was a promise, and I could not shake the feeling that this was not the end of it, that this was only the beginning of something I was not ready for, something I had already stepped into the moment I chose not to walk away. I did not sleep that night. Not really. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the city through my window, replaying every second over and over like my mind refused to let it settle. His voice, the way he said my name, the way he looked at me like I had stepped into something that already belonged to him. None of it made sense, and yet it felt too real to dismiss. I kept telling myself it was adrenaline. Just another night. Just another patient. Except he was not a patient. And that was the problem. Patients did not know your name without being told. Patients did not have men in tailored suits appearing out of nowhere. Patients did not look at you like they were memorizing you for later. I turned onto my side, then onto my back again, pulling the blanket tighter even though my skin still held the cold from the rain. My hands still remembered him. That was the part one could not shake. The physical memory of it, the weight of his grip, the steadiness in his voice. Like even on the edge of losing everything, he was still in control, and that thought unsettled me more than anything else, because control like that did not come from nowhere. It came from a world I had never wanted to understand. Eventually morning came in that quiet way it always does. Gray lights slipping through the blinds, the city waking up without asking permission, and I forced myself out of bed, forcing normal back into place. Coffee, shower, routine, all the small things that made life feel predictable, manageable, safe. I told myself that was what I needed, what I had to hold on to, because whatever happened last night, it was over now. It had to be. I dressed quickly, pulling my hair back, grabbing my bag, moving through the motions like nothing had changed, like I had not crossed a line I could not see. But as I stepped out onto the street, I felt it immediately, that same subtle shift, like something was off. Not wrong exactly, just different. The air felt heavier, the sound sharper, like my awareness had been turned up without my permission. I shook it off, telling myself I was imagining things, that I was just tired, that this would pass. The walk to the hospital took 15 minutes, familiar streets, familiar faces, everything exactly where it should be. And yet I found myself scanning more than usual, noticing details I had never paid attention to before, the way certain cars lingered longer than others, the way people moved around each other, the way silence settled in places it did not belong. I hated that I noticed these things now, hated that something in me had shifted enough to make it automatic. By the time I reached the hospital, I was already exhausted, not physically, but mentally, like I had been running all night without moving. The fluorescent lights greeted me the same as always, bright, steady, grounding. I signed in, nodded to familiar faces, slipped back into my role like it was armor, like it could protect me from whatever I had brushed up against the night before. Hours passed in a blur of routine, patients, charts, conversations that felt normal on the surface but distant underneath, like I was slightly out of sync with everything around me. I focused on the work, on the details, on the things I could control, because that was what I knew how to do. That was what kept everything from unraveling. And for a while, it worked. The memory of him faded to the edges. Still there but quieter, easier to ignore, until it was not. It happened just after noon. I had stepped into the hallway to grab supplies when I felt it again. That shift, stronger this time. Immediate, undeniable. Like the air itself had changed direction. I slowed without meaning to, my steps faltering as my instincts caught up before my thoughts did. And then I saw them. Two men standing near the far end of the corridor, dressed too sharply for this place. Too composed. Too still. They did not belong here. Not in this world of scrubs and rushed footsteps and controlled chaos. They stood out in a way that made everything else blur. And the moment one of them turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge me without fully looking, I knew. I did not know how, but I knew. My pulse quickened, my breath catching as that same realization settled in. This was not over. It had never been over. I forced myself to keep walking, to act like nothing was wrong, like I had not recognized them, like they were just visitors, just another part of the background. But every step felt heavier, every second stretched, and when I reached the supply room, I paused just inside the door, gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself, trying to think, trying to understand what this meant, why they were here, why now. I had not told anyone, had not spoken a word about last night. So how could this follow me here? How could it reach into the one place that was supposed to be separate, safe, untouched? My heart pounded harder as the answer formed whether I wanted it or not. This was never about what I said. It was about what I did, about the moment I chose not to walk away, about the line I crossed without realizing it had consequences. And then I heard it, soft, controlled, unmistakable. Ava, his voice, behind me, closer than it should have been, closer than I was ready for, and everything inside me stilled at once, because I knew without turning, without seeing, without needing confirmation, he was here, not in memory, not in thought, but real, present, standing somewhere just beyond the threshold of what I understood. And the part that terrified me most was not that he had found me. It was that some part of me had expected him to. I did not turn around right away, because turning would make it real, and something inside me was still trying to hold on to the illusion that this could be ignored, that if I stayed still long enough, if I focused on the sound of my own breathing and the distant noise of carts rolling down the hallway, he might disappear back into whatever world he came from. But the silence behind me did not shift. It settled, heavier, more deliberate, like it was waiting for me to acknowledge it, and slowly, against every instinct telling me not to, I turned, and there he was, standing just a few feet away as if he had always belonged in that space, as if the hospital corridor had adjusted itself to fit him rather than the other way around. He looked different from the night before, not weaker, not fragile, but composed, controlled, dressed in a way that made everything around him feel less defined, his presence sharpening the edges of the room. And for a moment I forgot how to speak, forgot how to think, because seeing him like this made the memory of him on the ground feel unreal, like I had imagined it, like I had invented that version of him just to make sense of something I was never meant to understand. "You should not be here," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended, but steady enough to hold, and he tilted his head slightly, like the statement amused him more than it concerned him. "I am exactly where I need to be," he replied, and the calm certainty in his voice made my chest tighten, because it was not arrogance, it was fact, and that was what made it dangerous. I glanced past him briefly, noticing the two men still positioned at a distance, not interfering, not speaking, just watching, always watching, and it made the space feel smaller somehow, like the walls had shifted inward without anyone noticing. "This is a hospital," I said, forcing the words out, grounding myself in something real, something normal. "People come here to be treated, not to be followed." And his eyes did not leave mine, not even for a second. "I was treated," he said simply, and something in the way he said it made my pulse jump, because it was not about medicine, not really. It was about me, about the moment I chose to stay, about the fact that I had already done something that connected us in a way I could not undo. "You need to leave," I added, stronger this time, stepping back just slightly to create space that did not feel like enough. And for the first time, something shifted in his expression, not anger, not frustration, but interest, like I had said something unexpected, something worth paying attention to. "You think this ends because you walk away," he said, his voice lower now, quieter, but somehow more present, like it reached further than the space between us, and I felt that line again, the one I crossed the night before, stretching tighter, pulling in a way I did not understand. "It ended the moment I left," I replied, even though the words did not feel true. Not anymore. Not with him standing here looking at me like that, like he knew something I did not, like he was waiting for me to realize it on my own. And then he took a step closer, not aggressive, not rushed, just deliberate, and my breath caught again because the distance disappeared too quickly, because proximity changed everything, made it harder to think, harder to pretend this was something simple. "If that were true," he said softly, "you would not still be thinking about it." And I opened my mouth to deny it, to push back, to say something that would restore the balance I felt slipping, but nothing came out, because he was right, and we both knew it. And that was the part that unsettled me most. Not that he had found me, not that he stood here like he belonged, but that he understood something about me I had not even admitted to myself. The silence stretched between us, thick, charged, until I forced myself to step back again, breaking whatever hold that moment had on me. "You cannot just show up like this," I said, my voice steadier now, anchored in something stronger than confusion. "I have a life here, a job, responsibilities. I am not part of whatever world you come from." And this time, he did not move, did not interrupt. He just watched me, listened, like my words mattered even if they changed nothing. "You are already part of it," he said after a moment, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as something else entirely. Something closer to inevitability, and I shook my head immediately, rejecting it before it could settle. "No," I said, sharper now, firmer, "I am not." But even as I said it, I felt the weight of everything that had already happened pressing against that denial, the memory of his hand, his voice, the way my name sounded when he said it. And I hated that it did not feel like enough to push him away, hated that some part of me hesitated. "Even now, even here, you chose not to walk away," he continued. And there it was again, that truth I had been trying to outrun since last night, that one decision, that one moment, echoing louder than anything else. That choice does not disappear because it is inconvenient. I swallowed hard, my heart beating faster as frustration mixed with something I could not name, something that felt too close to understanding, and I did not want to understand. Not this, not him. "Then what do you want?" I asked, finally, because that was the only question that mattered now, the only one I could not avoid. And for the first time since he arrived, his expression softened, not in weakness, but in something quieter, something more deliberate, like he had been waiting for me to ask. "I want to know why," he said, his voice steady, "why you stayed." And the question caught me off guard, not because it was difficult, but because it was simple, too simple for everything surrounding it. I hesitated, searching for an answer that made sense, that fit into the version of myself I understood, because that is what I do. I said finally, "I help people." And he held my gaze for a long second, like he was measuring the truth of it, weighing it against something else only he could see, and then he nodded slightly, as if confirming something. "Then you should understand this," he said, his tone unchanged but heavier somehow. "I do not forget the people who touch my life." And something in the way he said it made my chest tighten again, not from fear, not exactly, but from the realization that this was not about gratitude, not about repayment. It was about something deeper, something that did not follow the rules I knew. And as I stood there in the middle of a place that was supposed to be safe, supposed to be separate, I understood something I had been trying to avoid since the moment I heard my name in the rain. This was not something I could simply step away from, because it had already stepped into me. And as his eyes held mine with that same steady intensity, I realized the truth I had been fighting from the beginning. I had not just saved him, I had become part of something I could not yet see the end of. His words did not feel like a thank you, they felt like a decision. And that was what unsettled me the most, because decisions like that did not ask for permission. They simply happened, and I could feel it now, standing there in the hallway with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and people moving around us like nothing was wrong. Like the world had not just tilted slightly off its axis. I forced myself to hold his gaze, even though every instinct told me to step back, to put distance between us, to return to something safe and familiar. You do not get to decide what I am part of, I said, my voice steady but quieter than I intended, because something about him demanded that kind of control, demanded precision, and his expression shifted just slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition, like he understood the resistance, expected it even. I do not decide, he replied, calm as ever. I observe. And that answer should not have made sense, but somehow it did, because everything about him felt calculated, measured, like every move he made had already been considered long before it happened. And that realization sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I shook my head, trying to break free from the pull of it, from the way his presence seemed to rewrite the rules of the space around him. Then observe this, I said, stepping past him, forcing myself to move, to reclaim control in the only way I knew how. I am going back to work, and you are leaving. I did not wait for his response, did not give myself time to second guess. I walked, each step deliberate, measured, like if I slowed down for even a second, I might turn back, and I could not afford that. Not now. Not with everything already shifting beneath me. I reached the end of the hallway, turned the corner, and only then did I let out the breath I had been holding, my heart still racing, my thoughts catching up all at once, because what just happened did not fit into anything I understood, not into my routine, not into my world. And yet it was there now, unavoidable. I leaned briefly against the wall, closing my eyes for just a second, grounding myself in the familiar sounds around me, the distant voices, the steady rhythm of movement, reminding myself where I was, who I was, what mattered. But even that felt thinner now, like something had slipped between the cracks. I pushed myself upright and returned to work, forcing focus, forcing normal, moving from one patient to the next, one task to another, holding onto the structure like it was the only thing keeping everything from unraveling. And for a while, it worked. The memory of him faded just enough to function, just enough to pretend, until I noticed it, subtle at first, almost easy to ignore, a change in the way people moved, the way certain doors stayed closed a little longer, the way conversations lowered in tone as I passed. I frowned slightly, trying to place it, trying to understand what fell off, and then it clicked, not all at once, but piece by piece. The presence of those men had not disappeared. It had spread, quietly, carefully, like they were not just standing in one place anymore. They were everywhere I was not looking, positioned in ways that felt intentional, controlled. And suddenly the hospital did not feel like the same place it had this morning. It felt watched. Not in an obvious way, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to change the air, enough to make me aware of every step I took, every turn I made. I stopped at the nurse's station, pretending to check a chart while my mind raced. Because this could not be coincidence. This could not just be in my head. This was him. This was his world reaching into mine in ways I had not anticipated, and a slow, unsettling realization began to settle in. He did not need to follow me directly. He did not need to stand beside me to make his presence known. He could shape the space around me without ever touching it. And that was far more dangerous than anything I had imagined. I looked down at my hands again, at the faint traces of that night that I thought had disappeared, and I understood something new. Something sharper. This was not about control in the way I understood it. It was not force. It was influence, quiet, precise, unavoidable, and I did not know how to push back against something like that. I finished my shift in a blur, my awareness heightened in a way that refused to settle, every sound louder, every movement sharper, like I had stepped into a version of the world where everything mattered more. And by the time I stepped outside into the late afternoon light, I was already exhausted in a way sleep would not fix. The sky was clearer now, the rain gone, but the air still carried that same weight, that same feeling that something had shifted permanently. I stood there for a moment, just outside the hospital doors, letting the noise of the city wash over me, trying to decide what to do next, because going home felt different now. Walking away felt different. Everything felt different. And that was when I saw it. A black car parked across the street. Nothing unusual. On its own. Just another vehicle in a city full of them. But something about the way it sat there, still, deliberate, caught my attention. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into nothing. But as I watched, just for a second longer than necessary. The passenger door opened slightly, not enough to draw attention, just enough to confirm what I already knew. My pulse quickened again, that same realization settling deeper this time. This was not temporary. This was not a moment I could outwait or outdistance. This was something that had already woven itself into my life in ways I had not yet fully understood. And as I stood there, caught between stepping forward and turning back, I realized the truth I had been avoiding since the beginning. He was not just watching me. He was waiting, and I had no idea what would happen when I finally stopped pretending I could ignore it. I did not move right away, because stepping toward that car felt like admitting something I was not ready to admit, and stepping away felt like pretending I had not already noticed it. And for a few seconds I just stood there on the sidewalk, caught between instinct and denial. The late afternoon light stretching long shadows across the street, people passing by without a second glance, completely unaware that my world had narrowed down to that one black car and the quiet decision it represented. I told myself to walk, just walk home like I always did. Ignore it. Let it be just another coincidence in a city full of them. But my feet did not listen. They stayed rooted, because deep down I already knew. This was not coincidence. This was intention, and intention meant choice. Not mine, his. I exhaled slowly, steadying myself, and then I did the one thing I had been trying to avoid since I stepped out of the hospital. I crossed the street, each step measured, deliberate, like I was walking into something I could not yet see the shape of. The sounds of traffic faded slightly as I approached, replaced by the quiet hum of the idling engine. And when I reached the car, the door opened fully this time, smooth, controlled, like it had been waiting for me to get close enough to make it necessary. I hesitated for half a second, just long enough to remind myself that I could still turn around, that I still had a choice. But then I leaned down slightly and looked inside, and there he was, sitting in the back seat like the world outside did not apply to him, like everything moved on his terms whether I understood it or not. He did not look surprised to see me, not even a little. If anything, there was something in his expression that suggested this moment had already happened in his mind before it ever reached reality. You were going to keep walking, he said, his voice calm, almost observational, and I straightened slightly, folding my arms as a way to hold on to something solid. I almost did, I replied, because there was no point in pretending otherwise. He nodded once, like that answer confirmed something, like it fit into whatever calculation he had already made. And for a moment neither of us spoke. The space between us filled with that same quiet tension that had followed me since last night, the kind that did not demand attention but refused to disappear. You have been busy, I said finally, gesturing slightly toward the car, toward the invisible network that had followed me all day, because ignoring it no longer felt possible. His gaze did not shift, did not waver. I do not leave things unfinished, he replied, and there it was again. That word, things, like I was part of a list, part of something structured and deliberate, not random, not accidental, and I felt that resistance rise again, stronger this time, sharper. I am not a thing, I said, more firmly than before, and for the first time, something changed in his expression, not offense, not anger, but a subtle recognition, like he had expected that line, like he had been waiting for it. No, he said after a moment, his voice quieter now. You are not. And the way he said it did not dismiss me. It acknowledged me. And that somehow made it harder to push back, harder to maintain the distance I was trying to rebuild. I shifted my weight slightly, aware of how close I was, aware of how easy it would be to step back and end this conversation. And yet I did not move. Then why am I here? I asked, because that was the question that had been building since I saw the car, since I realized this was not something I could ignore, and he leaned back slightly, not breaking eye contact, just adjusting in a way that made him seem even more composed, even more certain. Because you chose to be, he said, and I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was too simple, too direct. Do not do that, I replied, shaking my head slightly. Do not make this sound like I walked into your car by accident. And he tilted his head just slightly, considering. You walked toward it, he said, and I opened my mouth to argue, to correct him, to explain that noticing something was not the same as choosing it. But the words stopped before they formed, because he was not wrong, not completely. I had crossed the street, I had stepped closer, I had looked inside instead of walking away, and that realization settled in with an uncomfortable weight, not heavy enough to break me, but enough to shift something, enough to make me aware of my own role in this. You do not understand how this works, I said instead, grasping for something more solid, something that would put distance back where it belonged. I have a life that does not involve you. I do not have time to be pulled into whatever this is. And his expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened, focused, like he was narrowing in on the part of my words that mattered most. I understand exactly how it works, he said, calm, certain. You believe you can separate what happened from what comes next, and my breath caught slightly. Because that was exactly what I had been trying to do since the moment I walked away last night. Separate, contain, control, and I cannot. I challenged, needing him to be wrong, needing there to be a way out that I could still claim. And he held my gaze for a long second, long enough for the world around us to fade just slightly, long enough for that quiet tension to settle deeper. You can try, he said finally, but that does not mean it will work. And something about the way he said it made my chest tighten again, not from fear, but from the realization that he was not trying to convince me. He was stating something he already believed to be true, something he had already accepted, and that difference mattered more than I wanted it to. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady myself, trying to find the version of this where I still had control. Then what? I asked, my voice quieter now, not weaker, just more focused. What happens next? And for the first time since I had known him, he paused. Not long, just enough to make the moment feel intentional, like he was choosing his words instead of letting them come naturally. And when he spoke again, his voice was softer, but somehow more certain than anything he had said before. That depends, he said, on whether you keep pretending you can walk away. And the words settled between us, simple, direct, impossible to ignore. And as I stood there on the sidewalk with the city moving around us like nothing had changed, I realized something I had not been ready to admit until now. This was not about him pulling me in. It was about me deciding how far I was willing to step. And the truth that followed that realization was the one thing I could not escape. I had already taken the first step, and I did not know how many more I was willing to take. I should have left right then, closed the distance between myself and everything I understood, but instead I stayed exactly where I was, standing beside that car like the world had narrowed down to a single decision I was not ready to make. The city moved around us, cars passing, people talking, footsteps echoing against the pavement, but none of it reached me the same way. It all felt distant, like I was standing just outside of it. And he was the reason why. I could feel it in the way my thoughts slowed, in the way my attention stayed fixed on him no matter how much I tried to break it. You talk like this is inevitable, I said, my voice quieter now, not defensive, just searching, because that was what this had become, not a confrontation, not anymore, but something else, something that felt closer to understanding even if I did not want it to. He watched me for a moment, that same steady gaze that never rushed, never wavered, like he had all the time in the world to let me catch up. It is not inevitable, he replied, calm as always. It is consistent. And the distinction hit me harder than I expected, because consistency meant pattern, and pattern meant choice, repeated, intentional, something that built over time whether I noticed it or not. And I realized then that he was not talking about this moment alone. He was talking about everything that had led to it, every step, every hesitation, every time I chose to look instead of walk away. I folded my arms tighter, grounding myself in something physical, something I could control. You are reading too much into this, I said, even though the words felt weaker now, less certain than they had before, because some part of me knew he was not guessing, he was observing, exactly like he said, and that made it harder to dismiss. Am I? He asked, not challenging, not mocking, just asking, like he was genuinely interested in my answer. And that unsettled me more than if he had argued, because it forced me to think, to consider what I had been avoiding. I looked away briefly, glancing down the street, watching the flow of people who had no idea how complicated something as simple as standing still could become, and for a second I envied them. Envied the simplicity of not knowing, of not being pulled into something that did not follow the same rules. I have responsibilities, I said finally, turning back to him, needing to anchor myself in something real. People who rely on me, a life that does not include being watched or followed or analyzed. And his expression softened again, just slightly, like he understood that part more than the rest. "And you think I am taking that away from you?" he said, and I hesitated, because that was not exactly it. Not completely. It was not that he was taking something. It was that he was adding something I did not know how to manage, something that did not fit into the structure I had built. "I think you are complicating it," I replied, choosing my words carefully, because this was no longer about pushing him away. It was about understanding what I was dealing with, and his lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile, but something close, something that acknowledged the truth in what I said. "It was already complicated," he said quietly. "You just did not see it yet." And that landed deeper than I expected, because it suggested something I had not considered, that maybe this was not entirely new, that maybe the world had always been layered in ways I had chosen not to notice, and he was simply the moment that forced me to look. I exhaled slowly, letting that thought settle without fully accepting it. "So what now?" I asked again, because that question still mattered, still hung between us like something waiting to be decided. And this time he did not answer right away. He studied me instead, like he was measuring something I could not see, like he was waiting for something to shift, and then he reached forward slightly, not enough to touch me, just enough to close the space in a way that felt intentional, controlled. "Now you decide how much of this you are willing to understand," he said, his voice lower, steadier, and I felt that same tension return, not fear, not exactly, but awareness, heightened, focused, like every part of me was paying attention whether I wanted it to or not. "Understanding it does not mean accepting it," I said quickly, holding on to that distinction, because it felt important, like a boundary I could still maintain, and he nodded once, immediately, like he agreed, like that boundary mattered to him in a way I did not expect. "No," he said, "but refusing to understand it does not make it disappear." And there it was again, that balance he kept forcing me to confront, not pushing, not pulling, just presenting something that existed whether I acknowledged it or not. And I realized then that this was not about him convincing me of anything. It was about him showing me that the choice had already begun, that I was already in the middle of it whether I wanted to be or not. I looked at him for a long second, really looked this time, not at the way he dressed or the way he carried himself, but at the way he existed in the moment, completely certain, completely present, like nothing about this was unclear to him. And for the first time, I felt something shift inside me, not resistance, not exactly, but curiosity, cautious, controlled, but there, undeniable. "And if I decide I do not want any part of it?" I asked, needing to hear it, needing to know where the edge of this was. And his gaze did not soften, did not change. It stayed exactly the same, steady, grounded, like the answer had always been there waiting for me to ask. "Then you walk away," he said simply. And the words should have been reassuring, should have made everything easier, but they did not, because there was something else beneath them, something unspoken, something that lingered in the space between us, not preventing me, not stopping me, but reminding me of everything I had already done, everything I had already stepped into. And as I stood there, feeling the weight of that choice settle more clearly than before, I realized the truth that had been building since the moment I found him in the rain. Walking away was still possible, but it was no longer simple, because now it meant leaving behind something I had already begun to understand. And for the first time since all of this started, I was not entirely sure that was what I wanted to do. The word walk away stayed in my mind longer than it should have, echoing in a way that made everything else feel quieter, like the city itself had dimmed just enough for that choice to stand out, sharp and unavoidable. And I realized I was still standing there, still close enough to the car to feel the warmth of the engine, still close enough to him that leaving would require more than just turning around. It would require decision. And that was the part that felt different now, because before, leaving had been instinct, automatic, but now it felt deliberate, like something I would have to choose with full awareness of what I was stepping away from. I shifted slightly, glancing down the street again, watching people pass by without hesitation, without weight in their steps, and I envied that simplicity more than I wanted to admit. "You make it sound easy," I said, my voice quieter now, not challenging, just honest, because that was what this had become, not a fight, not resistance, but something closer to clarity. and he watched me with that same steady focus, like he was waiting for me to reach the part that mattered on my own. "It is simple," he replied. "It is just not easy." And that distinction settled deeper than anything else he had said, because it matched exactly what I was feeling, the difference between knowing what to do and actually doing it. I let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of that settle into something real, something I could not ignore. "And if I stay?" I asked, not looking at him for a second, because saying it out loud made it feel more real than I was ready for. "What does that mean?" And there was a pause, not long, but enough to make the moment feel intentional, like he understood the importance of the question, like he was choosing his answer carefully. "It means you stop pretending this is temporary," he said, his voice steady, grounded, and I felt something tighten in my chest again. Not fear, not exactly, but recognition, because that was the part one had been holding on to since the beginning, the idea that this would pass, that it would fade, that I could return to something unchanged. And hearing him say it out loud made it clear that he did not believe that. Not even a little. "I do not know what this is," I admitted, finally, because pretending otherwise felt pointless now. "I do not understand your world. I do not know how any of this fits into my life." And he nodded slightly, like he expected that, like it did not change anything. "You are not supposed to understand it all at once," he said. "You are only supposed to decide if you are willing to see it." And the way he said it shifted something again, made it feel less like a demand and more like an invitation, and that was somehow more unsettling, because invitations could be accepted, could be chosen, and that meant responsibility. I looked at him again, really looked this time, not just at his presence, but at the way he spoke, the way he held himself, the way everything about him felt intentional without being forced, and I realized something I had not allowed myself to consider before. He was not trying to pull me into his world the way I had imagined. He was simply refusing to let me pretend it did not exist, and that difference mattered more than I wanted it to. "You are not asking me," I said slowly, piecing it together as I spoke. "You are waiting for me to decide." And something in his expression shifted again, not surprise, not approval, but recognition, like I had reached the point he had been watching for. "Yes," he said, and the simplicity of that answer made everything else fall into place in a way that felt both clear and overwhelming. Because it meant this was not about control, not in the way I had feared. It was about awareness, about choice, about stepping into something with open eyes instead of being pulled into it without understanding. And that realization changed the way the moment felt, not safer, but more defined, more real. I exhaled slowly, letting that settle, letting the noise of the city come back into focus around us, grounding myself in something familiar while I processed something entirely new. "And if I say no?" I asked again, because I needed to hear it one more time, needed to know that boundaries still existed. And his gaze held mine without hesitation. "Then you leave," he said, just as steady as before, just as certain, and I believed him, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way he said them, like he meant it, like he would allow it. And that made the choice heavier, not lighter, because now it was real, now. It was mine. I looked down for a moment, at the space between us, at the edge of the car door still open, at the thin line between stepping closer and stepping away, and I realized that I had been standing on that line since the moment I crossed the street, since the moment I chose to look instead of ignore, and the truth settled in quietly, but completely. I had already moved, not physically, but mentally, emotionally. I had already stepped into something I could not fully step out of without. Losing something I did not yet understand. I lifted my gaze back to him, meeting his eyes with a steadiness I had not felt before, not because I was less uncertain, but because I was more aware of it, more willing to face it. "I am not saying yes," I said slowly, choosing each word carefully. "But I am not walking away either." And the moment the words left my mouth, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the air itself adjusted to the decision, and he did not smile, did not react in any obvious way, but there was something in his eyes that changed, something quieter, more settled, like a piece had fallen into place exactly where it was supposed to. "That is enough," he said, and those 3 words carried more weight than I expected, not because of what they meant, but because of how they felt, like a beginning instead of an end, like a door opening instead of closing. And as I stood there on that sidewalk with the city moving around us and the future stretching out in ways I could not yet see, I understood something I had not been ready to admit until now. This was not about being pulled into his world or escaping it entirely. It was about what happened in between, in the space where choice lived, and for the first time since all of this started, I was no longer just reacting to it. I was stepping into it, even if I did not yet know how far I was willing to go. The moment I said it, something changed in the space between us, not louder, not dramatic, just clearer, like a line had been drawn, and we both understood exactly where it stood. I was not walking away, but I was not stepping in either. Not fully. Not yet. And for the first time since this began, I felt something close to balance, fragile, uncertain, but mine. I straightened slightly, pulling my shoulders back as if that could reinforce the decision, as if posture alone could remind me that I still had control over what came next. This does not mean anything changes, I added, needing to say it out loud, needing to define the boundary before it blurred. And he watched me with that same calm attention, not interrupting, not correcting, just listening, which somehow made it harder to hold on to the certainty I was trying to project. Everything has already changed, he said quietly, not as a contradiction, but as a statement that existed whether I accepted it or not. And I felt that familiar tension again, the one that came from hearing something true that I was not ready to fully acknowledge. I exhaled slowly, letting it pass without arguing, because arguing would not undo anything. It would only delay what I was already beginning to understand. Then I decide how much, I said, more to myself than to him, testing the words as they formed, and he nodded once, like that was exactly the point. Like that was the only part that mattered. The silence that followed was different this time. Not heavy, not uncertain, just present, like it was allowing the moment to settle into something real. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to fill it. I did not rush to speak or step away. I simply stood there, aware of him, aware of myself, aware of the space in between, and that awareness felt new, uncomfortable but steady. Like learning how to stand on ground that shifted slightly under your feet. Get in, he said after a moment, his voice calm, almost casual, like the request was simple, like it did not carry the weight I immediately felt in my chest. And I looked at him, really looked this time, searching for something in his expression that would tell me how much this mattered, how far this step would take me, but his face revealed nothing beyond that same quiet certainty. No, I replied without hesitation, because that line was still clear, still intact, and I needed it to stay that way, needed to prove to myself that I could still draw boundaries and hold them. And again, he did not react with frustration or pressure. He simply accepted it, like he had already accounted for that answer, like it fit into the pattern he had been observing all along. Then we start where you are comfortable, he said, and the way he said it shifted something again, made it feel less like a test and more like a process. Something gradual, something that did not require everything at once. And I found myself nodding slightly before I even realized I had agreed to anything, which unsettled me more than I wanted to admit, because it meant I was already participating in something I had not fully defined. You keep saying that like you already know how this ends, I said, needing to push back just enough to remind both of us that I was still thinking, still choosing. And he held my gaze for a long second, longer than before, like the question mattered more than the others had. I do not know how it ends, he said finally, and there was something different in his tone this time, something less certain, not weaker, but more honest. I only know it does not end the way you expect. And that answer stayed with me longer than anything else he had said, because it removed the sense of control I had been assigning to him. It suggested that whatever this was, it was not entirely in his hands either, and that made it more real, more unpredictable, more dangerous in a way I could not easily define. I glanced down the street again, the world continuing on without us, unaffected, unchanged, and I wondered how something so significant could exist in such a small, quiet space. How a single conversation could shift the direction of everything without anyone else even noticing. I should go, I said finally, not because I wanted to leave, but because staying too long felt like losing the edge I had just found. And he nodded immediately, not stopping me, not questioning it, just accepting it like he had accepted everything else, and that made it easier, not because it reduced the weight, but because it confirmed something important. This was still my choice, still my movement, still my pace. I stepped back from the car then, creating distance again, but this time it felt different, not like escape, not like retreat, but like space, intentional, controlled, something I could step back into if I chose to. I turned slightly, ready to walk, ready to return to something familiar, but I paused for just a second, looking back at him one more time, because something in me needed to mark this moment, needed to acknowledge that this was not the same as before. This does not mean I trust you, I said, because that truth mattered, because it was one of the few things that still felt solid, and his expression did not change, did not shift into offense or defense. It remained exactly the same, steady, grounded, like trust was not something he expected. I am not asking you to, he replied, and the simplicity of that answer made everything else feel clearer, sharper, like the rules of this were not what I had assumed they would be. I nodded once, more to myself than to him, and then I turned fully this time, stepping away from the car, from him, from the space that had held me in place longer than I intended, and as I walked down the street, the sounds of the city returning to full volume around me, I felt something shift again, not in the world, but in myself, something subtle but undeniable, like a door had opened, and I had chosen not to close it, not yet, and that realization followed me with every step, steady, present, impossible to ignore, because for the first time since all of this began, I was not just reacting to him, I was responding, choosing, and somewhere in that difference, I knew the path ahead had already begun to change, even if I did not yet know where it would lead. Walking away should have felt like relief, like I had reclaimed something that was mine, but instead it felt like carrying something with me, something invisible but constant, like a weight that did not slow me down but refused to be ignored. Every step down the sidewalk felt sharper, more deliberate, like I was aware of the ground beneath me in a way I had never been before. The city moved the same as always, horns in the distance, footsteps passing, conversations blending into noise, but none of it felt as distant anymore. It felt closer, louder, like my senses had been tuned differently, and there was no way to turn them back. I kept walking, hands in my pockets, eyes forward, telling myself this was normal, that this was what it meant to leave, to return to my life. But the truth settled in quietly. I had not returned to anything. I had carried something forward, something that had already begun to shape the way I saw everything around me. I reached my apartment building 10 minutes later, the familiar brick exterior grounding in a way I needed. I pushed through the front door, the quiet hum of the lobby wrapping around me, steady, predictable, safe. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, letting it settle, letting myself breathe without thinking about what came next. But even here, even in a place that had never felt complicated before, something was different, not in the space itself, but in me, in the way I noticed things I had never paid attention to before. The security camera above the door, the reflection in the glass, the way the hallway curved just enough to block sight lines, details that had always been there, but never mattered, until now. I shook my head slightly, trying to push it away, trying to hold on to something simpler, something familiar, but it did not leave. It stayed, quiet, constant, like a shift that had already settled too deep to reverse. I took the stairs instead of the elevator, needing the movement, needing the rhythm of each step to steady my thoughts. My apartment door came into view at the end of the hall, the same as always, unchanged, and for a moment I just stood there, looking at it, realizing that crossing that threshold would not bring me back to who I was before. It would only place this new awareness inside the space I used to call separate. I unlocked the door slowly, stepping inside, the quiet wrapping around me immediately, familiar, comforting, and yet not enough to erase what followed me in. I set my bag down on the small table, moved toward the kitchen out of habit, filling a glass of water, just to have something to do, something simple, something controlled. I leaned against the counter, staring at nothing in particular, replaying everything without meaning to, his voice, his words, the way he did not push, did not force, but still managed to shift everything without raising his voice or stepping closer than necessary. And that was the part that stayed with me the most, not what he did, but how he did it. Like everything had already been considered before it happened, like I had stepped into a pattern that existed long before I noticed it. I took a sip of water, the coolness grounding me slightly, pulling me back into the present. But even then, even standing alone in my own kitchen, I felt it. That same awareness, that same sense that something had changed in a way I could not undo. I set the glass down slowly, exhaling as I tried to organize my thoughts into something that made sense, something that fit into the life I had built. But every time I tried, it slipped, like the pieces no longer aligned the way they used to, like something new had been added, and I did not yet know where it belonged. I moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just slightly, looking out at the street below, cars passing, people moving, the world continuing as if nothing had shifted, and for a moment I envied that. The simplicity of not knowing, the ease of moving through a day without questioning what existed beneath it. But that feeling did not last, because I knew I could not go back to that. Not completely, not after seeing what I had seen, not after choosing not to walk away. I let the curtain fall back into place, stepping away from the window. The quiet of the apartment settling around me again, heavier now, more aware, and I realized something I had not fully understood until this moment. This was not about him being present or absent. It was about what he had already changed in me. The way I saw things, the way I thought, the way I noticed patterns I had never considered before, and that realization made everything feel different. Not worse, not better, just different, like the edges of my life had sharpened slightly, revealing details I had been too comfortable to notice. I sat down on the edge of the couch, leaning forward slightly, elbows on my knees, trying to process what this meant, what came next, because this was no longer about a single moment or a single choice. It was about a shift that had already begun to unfold, whether I wanted it to or not. My phone buzzed on the table beside me, the sudden sound pulling me out of my thoughts. I glanced at it automatically, expecting something routine, a message, a reminder, something normal. But when I picked it up, the screen showed an unknown number, no name, no context, just a single message, simple, direct, impossible to misinterpret. You made the right choice. I stared at the words for a long second, my pulse picking up again, not from fear, but from recognition, because I knew exactly who it was without needing confirmation. I knew the tone, the certainty, the way it acknowledged my decision without asking for anything in return, and something in my chest tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in awareness, because this was not over, not even close. This was just the next step, the next movement in something I had already begun to step into. I locked the phone without responding, setting it back down on the table, my gaze lingering on it for just a second longer before I looked away, because answering would mean something, and not answering meant something too. And for now, I was still learning the difference between the two. I leaned back slowly, letting the quiet settle around me once more, but this time it did not feel the same. It felt like a pause instead of an ending, like the space between moments rather than the conclusion of one. And as I sat there, aware of everything that had already shifted and everything that had yet to unfold, I realized the one thing I could no longer deny. I was not just part of this anymore. I was starting to understand it, and that made whatever came next impossible to ignore. I did not reply to the message that night, and maybe that was my way of holding on to something that still felt like mine. A small space where I could choose silence instead of reaction. But silence did not mean absence. It stayed there on my phone, on my mind, like a quiet presence that did not demand attention but refused to disappear. I went through the rest of the evening on autopilot, making dinner I barely tasted, turning on the television without hearing a single word, pacing the length of my apartment like movement alone could settle something that had already begun to shift too deep for that. And every time I tried to push it aside, to return to something familiar, it came back, not louder, not stronger, just steady, like it was waiting for me to acknowledge it fully. I did not sleep much, not because I was afraid, but because my mind refused to slow down, every detail replaying with a clarity that felt new. The way he spoke, the way he waited instead of pushed, the way everything seemed to unfold at a pace that felt controlled but not forced. And that was the part one kept coming back to. The control, not over me, but over himself, over the situation, like he understood something I was still trying to grasp. Morning came too quickly, the soft light filtering through my window, pulling me back into a world that looked exactly the same as it had the day before, and yet felt completely different. I got ready for work in silence, moving through each step with a precision that felt almost deliberate, like I was testing whether routine could still ground me the way it used to: coffee, shower, clothes, the familiar rhythm of preparation. And for a moment it worked. For a moment, I felt like I could step back into my life without carrying the weight of everything else with me. But the illusion did not last, because awareness does not disappear once it arrives. It stays, subtle but constant, reshaping the way you move through even the most ordinary moments. The walk to the hospital felt shorter than usual, not because the distance had changed, but because my attention had. I noticed more: the way people moved, the way certain patterns repeated, the way small details connected in ways I had never considered before, and I realized then that this was not something external, not something he had placed around me. This was something internal, something I had begun to see on my own, and that made it harder to dismiss, harder to ignore. I entered the hospital, the familiar environment greeting me with its usual rhythm, the hum of machines, the quiet urgency of movement, the structure I had always relied on. And for a moment I let myself settle into it, let the routine carry me forward, because that was what I knew, that was what I trusted. Hours passed in a steady flow, patients, charts, conversations, everything moving exactly as it should, and I held on to that, letting it anchor me, reminding myself that this was still my world, still my responsibility, still the place where I understood the rules. But even as I moved through it, that awareness lingered, not disrupting, not interfering, just present, like a layer beneath everything else. And then it happened again, subtle at first, almost easy to miss, a shift in the way the air felt, a quiet change in the rhythm of the space around me, and I paused, just for a second, recognizing it before I fully understood it. Because I had felt it before, I turned slightly, my gaze moving down the hallway, and there he was, not standing in the center this time, not drawing attention, but present in a way that did not need to be obvious, leaning slightly against the far wall, speaking quietly to one of the men beside him, his posture relaxed, controlled, like he was part of the space rather than interrupting it. And something in me did not react the way it had before. There was no immediate tension, no sharp spike of surprise, just a steady recognition, like I had expected this, like some part of me had already accounted for his presence before I saw it. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, watching, not in hesitation, but in observation, noticing the details I had not fully registered before, the way people unconsciously adjusted their paths around him, the way the space seemed to organize itself without anyone realizing why. And I understood something new then, something that shifted my perspective again. He did not force attention, he shaped it, subtly, consistently, until it became part of the environment itself. And that was a different kind of power than I had imagined. Not loud, not obvious, but precise, controlled, and I felt that same awareness settle deeper, not as resistance, but as understanding. I stepped forward then, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving. And as I approached, his conversation ended naturally, like it had been timed to do so, like everything around him moved in a pattern I was only beginning to see. His gaze lifted to meet mine, steady, familiar now in a way that surprised me, and for the first time, I did not feel the need to look away. "You are early," I said, my voice even, controlled, and he tilted his head slightly, that same subtle acknowledgement in his expression. "You noticed," he replied, and the simplicity of that exchange made something shift again, because it was not about what was said, it was about what was understood. I stopped a few feet away, the distance intentional, but no longer defensive, just defined. "I am working," I added, not as a barrier, but as a fact, and he nodded immediately, respecting it, without question, without negotiation, and that, more than anything else, made this feel different, because it meant he was not here to disrupt, not here to take. He was here within the boundaries I set, even if I was still figuring out what those boundaries were. "And I am not interrupting," he said calmly, and again, the balance held, the space between us clear, controlled, something we both seemed to understand without needing to define it further. I studied him for a moment, the questions still there, the uncertainty still present, but something else layered over it now, something quieter, something closer to acceptance, not of him, not completely, but of the situation itself, of the fact that this was happening whether I resisted it or not, and that resisting alone was no longer enough to define my place in it. You said I would start to understand, I said slowly, testing the thought as I spoke it, and his gaze did not waver, did not shift, it stayed exactly where it was. Focused, steady, waiting. I am starting to see what you meant, and for the first time, something in his expression softened in a way that felt different from before, not satisfaction, not approval, but recognition, like this moment mattered in a way that had nothing to do with control or outcome, just the process itself. And as I stood there in the middle of a place that had once felt completely separate from everything else, I realized something I had not fully understood until now. This was no longer about whether he would appear or not. It was about how I chose to meet that presence when it did. And for the first time, I was not just reacting to it. I was engaging with it, on my terms, in my space, and that difference changed everything, even if I did not yet know what it would lead to. Understanding did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, in quiet moments between tasks, in the way I began to notice patterns that had always existed but never demanded my attention before. And as I stood there facing him in the hallway, something shifted again, not in him, but in me. In the way I held the moment, in the way I no longer felt the need to push it away immediately. Seeing is not the same as agreeing, I said, my voice calm, measured, because that distinction mattered more now than it had before, and he inclined his head slightly, acknowledging it without argument, without trying to redefine it, which made it easier to hold on to, easier to believe that I still had space within this. I did not ask you to agree, he replied, and his tone carried that same steady certainty, but now it felt different, less like pressure and more like structure, something I could navigate rather than something I had to resist. I glanced down the hallway briefly, the familiar movement of staff and patients continuing around us, and I realized how strange it was that this conversation could exist so clearly within a place that had always been defined by urgency and routine, and yet nothing about this moment felt out of place anymore. It felt integrated, like it belonged within the flow rather than disrupting it. Then what are you asking? I said, turning my attention back to him, because the question still mattered, still needed shape, and he studied me for a moment, not searching, not hesitating, just measuring, like he was aligning my question with something already formed in his mind. For you to stop pretending you are not already involved, he said, and this time the words did not hit with the same resistance. They settled, quieter, more precise, because I could no longer deny the truth behind them, not after everything I had already seen, everything I had already chosen. I crossed my arms lightly, not defensive, just thoughtful, grounding myself in the posture as I considered what that actually meant, because involvement did not have to mean surrender. It did not have to mean losing control. It could mean awareness, participation, choice, but those distinctions were still new, still forming. Involved does not mean controlled, I said slowly, testing the boundary as I defined it, and he nodded once, immediately, as if that line was already understood, already part of the structure he was working within. Correct, he said, and the simplicity of that agreement made something settle more firmly inside me, because it confirmed that this was not about taking something from me. It was about expanding something I already had, my awareness, my choices, my understanding of how the world could work beyond what I had allowed myself to see before. I let out a slow breath, feeling the shift in my own perspective as it happened, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady, like a door opening a few inches wider than before. Then you need to understand something too, I said, meeting his gaze fully now, holding it without hesitation, because this part mattered. I do not move at your pace. And for the first time, there was a pause in him, not long, not uncertain, but noticeable, like he was adjusting something internally, recalibrating the pattern he had been following. And then he nodded again, slower this time, more deliberate. You move at yours, he said, and the way he said it felt different, more aligned, like the balance between us had shifted into something more equal, something that did not rely on one side leading the other. And that realization brought a kind of clarity I had not expected, because it meant I was not being pulled forward. I was choosing each step as I took it, even if I did not yet know where those Steps would lead. The tension that had been present from the beginning did not disappear, but it changed, softened into something more focused, less about resistance and more about awareness, about understanding the space I was standing in and what it meant to remain there. Then this stays here, I said, gesturing slightly around us, indicating the hospital, the environment I understood, the place where I still felt grounded. I do my job, I live my life, and whatever this is does not interfere with that. And again, he did not argue, did not push, he considered it, waited, and then nodded. It does not interfere, he said. It exists alongside. And the phrasing mattered, the distinction mattered, because interference implied disruption, while existing alongside suggested something parallel, something that could run without crossing into what I had built, and that made it easier to accept, easier to hold on to as a condition rather than a compromise. I studied him for another moment, looking for any sign that this was temporary, that this agreement would shift the moment I turned away, but there was nothing in his expression to suggest that, only that same steady certainty, that same controlled presence that had been there from the beginning. And I realized something then, something that settled quietly but firmly. He was not unpredictable in the way I had feared. He was consistent, and consistency, once understood, could be navigated, could be worked with, could be balanced against my own choices. Then we understand each other, I said, more as a statement than a question, and he held my gaze for a long second before responding. We are beginning to, he said, and the wording struck me, not final, not complete, just a beginning. And that felt accurate, more accurate than anything else, because this was not something that could be defined in a single conversation. It was something that would unfold, piece by piece, decision by decision. I nodded once, acknowledging that truth without fully embracing it, because embracing it would mean accepting how much this could change, and I was not ready for that yet. Not completely. I have work to do, I said, stepping back slightly, reestablishing the boundary of my role, my responsibility, the part of my life that remained unchanged, and he did not stop me, did not follow. He simply inclined his head slightly, a quiet acknowledgement that the moment had reached its natural end. And as I turned and walked away, moving back into the rhythm of the hospital, I felt something settle more clearly than before, not resolution, not certainty, but alignment, like the pieces I had been trying to separate were beginning to exist in the same space, without colliding. And that made everything feel different, not easier, but more possible, because for the first time since this began, I was not trying to escape it or deny it. I was learning how to exist within it, on my terms, at my pace. And as that understanding settled deeper with each step I took, I realized something that changed the way I saw everything that had happened so far. This was not about him entering my world or me entering his. It was about the space where those two worlds met, and the choices I made within that space would define everything that came next. It did not feel like an ending, not even close. It felt like standing at the edge of something that had only just begun to take shape. Like everything up to this point had been a quiet introduction to a story I was only now starting to understand. And as I moved through the rest of my shift, something inside me stayed steady in a way it had not before, not because I had answers, but because I had stopped fighting the questions. I worked, I focused, I did everything I was supposed to do, but beneath that, there was something else, something constant, like a second layer of awareness that moved with me instead of against me. And for the first time, it did not feel overwhelming. It felt intentional, like I was learning how to carry it instead of pushing it away. Hours passed, the rhythm of the hospital guiding me through each task, each conversation, each moment that required my full attention, and I gave it, because that was still who I was, still what defined me, but now it existed, alongside something new, something I had chosen not to ignore, and that choice changed the way everything felt, not heavier, just more real. By the time my shift ended, the sky outside had already begun to darken, the city shifting into its evening rhythm, lights turning on, movement slowing just enough to feel different from the rush of the day. I stepped outside, pausing for a moment on the sidewalk, letting the cool air settle against my skin, grounding me in the transition between one part of my life and another. And for a second, everything felt quiet, balanced, like I had found a way to hold both worlds without letting one take over the other. But that feeling did not last, not because it broke, but because it evolved. Because the moment I became aware of it, I also became aware of something else, something familiar, something I no longer needed to see to recognize. I did not look right away. I did not need to. I could feel it, that same shift in the air, that same subtle change in the way the space around me organized itself. And instead of resisting it, instead of pretending it was not there, I acknowledged it, quietly, internally, like accepting a truth I had already learned. Then I turned, slowly, deliberately, and there he was, standing across the street, not hidden, not distant, just present, exactly where I expected him to be. And something in me did not react the way it would have before. There was no sharp intake of breath, no instinct to step back, just a steady recognition, like this had become part of the pattern, part of the rhythm I was beginning to understand. I crossed the street without hesitation, my steps measured, controlled, not because I was being pulled, but because I was choosing to move. And when I reached him, I stopped at a distance that felt right, not too close, not too far, just enough to hold the space between us clearly. "You said you would not interfere," I said, my voice calm, not accusing, just stating what needed to be said, and he met my gaze with that same steady focus. Unchanged, grounded. "I am not interfering," he replied, and I held his eyes for a second longer, measuring the truth in his words, and I realized that he was right. He had not disrupted my day, had not crossed the boundaries I set. He had simply been present, consistent, exactly as he said he would be, and that realization shifted something again, deepening the understanding I had been building. "You are consistent," I said quietly, more to myself than to him, and he inclined his head slightly, acknowledging it without pride, without emphasis, like it was simply a fact, and I nodded once, letting that settle, because consistency meant predictability, and predictability meant I could navigate this. I could understand it. I could exist within it without losing myself. And that was the part that mattered most. "I am learning," I added after a moment, the words coming easier than I expected. And for the first time, there was something in his expression that felt almost like approval, not directed at me, but at the process itself, like this was exactly what he had been waiting for. Not submission, not agreement, just understanding. "That is all that matters," he said, and the simplicity of it made everything else fall into place in a way that felt clear, grounded, real. I looked around briefly. The city moving around us, unchanged, unaware, and I realized how strange it was that something so significant could exist so quietly within it. How something that felt this important could be invisible to everyone else. And then I looked back at him, meeting his gaze without hesitation, without uncertainty, because that part had shifted too. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to make this moment feel different from every other one before it. "This does not control me," I said, because that truth still mattered, still defined the line I was not willing to cross. And he nodded immediately, without hesitation, without question. "No," he said, "it does not." And the certainty in his voice reinforced something I had already begun to understand. This was not about control, it was about choice, and that distinction was everything. I took a step back then, not to leave, not to escape, but to create space, to remind myself that I still moved on my own terms, and as I did, I felt it. That same balance I had been searching for from the beginning. Not perfect, not permanent, but real, something I could stand on without losing my footing. "Then we continue like this," I said, defining it in the only way that made sense, not as a question, but as a decision, and he held my gaze for a long second before responding. "For now," he said, and those two words carried more weight than anything else, because they acknowledged what we both understood. This was not finished, this was not settled. This was only the beginning of something that would continue to unfold, step by step, choice by choice. And as I turned to leave, walking back toward my own world with that awareness still steady inside me, I realized the truth that had been building since the very first moment I chose not to walk away. I did not just save him that night, I changed the direction of my own life. And whatever came next, whatever this became, it would not be something I could simply step out of, because I was no longer standing outside of it. I was already part of it, and for the first time, I was not afraid of that.